Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first talk of the 2023-24 Sulgrave Seminar Series. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dr. Caroline Dodds Pennock. Dr. Dodds Pennock is a senior lecturer in international history at the University of Sheffield and the only British Aztec historian. She's the author of On Savage Shores, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe. That's what she's going to be talking to us about this evening, which was BBC Radio 4's Book of the Week in January 2023. Her first book, Bonds of Blood, Gender, Life Cycle and Sacrifice in Aztec Culture, won the Royal Historical Society's Gladstone Prize for 2008. Caroline has regularly appeared on TV and radio for broadcasters, including the BBC, Channel 4, Smithsonian Channel and Netflix, and she has acted as a named historical consultant for several TV and book projects, as well as writing for popular publications, including Scientific American, BBC History Magazine, BBC World Histories, BBC Knowledge Magazine, and History Today. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Dodds Pennock to talk to us this evening. She's been very much in demand because of the success of her wonderful book that she's going to be talking to you about. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Caroline. Before I do, though, just a couple of words on the format for this evening. So Caroline has said she's happy to take questions as and when they come in. So you can ask Caroline your questions in the Q&A function on this Zoom webinar. Pop your questions in there as and when they come in, but there'll also be time at the end of the talk for you to ask those questions as well, and we'll make sure we have space for that. So without further ado, Caroline, it is all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation from Sulgrave Manor to come and speak to the seminar series. It's really nice to have a chance to talk to a different audience, although I wish I could see you all, but I think we're getting used, aren't we, to this kind of Zoom format. It is slightly strange to feel like you're talking to yourself, though. What I'm going to do is to share a PowerPoint so you can see some of the images of the Indigenous people who travelled to Europe that my book is about, and I'll talk for about 20-25 minutes before we have Q&A, so there'll be plenty of time for conversation afterwards. So let me share my screen and make that work, and hopefully everybody will let me know if this isn't working. So, as you know, I am here to talk about my book On Savage Shores, which just came out in January. It was my first ever book for a popular audience, and I've been working on it for about a decade. The main aim in the book was to transform the way that people think about the early period of encounter between Europe and what we now call the Americas. People at the time didn't call it that, of course, by writing Indigenous people back into our understanding of the period after 1492, that first moment of meeting and the early years of exchange, the beginnings of globalization, if you will. This is a period that people often think they know really well. It's the time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the golden age of Spain, the Reformation and the Renaissance. But how many people know that a Brazilian king met Henry VIII? That Indigenous Mexicans mocked up human sacrifice at the court of Charles V, that the first people to make drinking chocolate in Europe were a group of Maya lords, or that a Brazilian village was recreated on the shores of the River Seine for the curiosity of the cream of the French aristocracy. Native American peoples are missing from our mental image of this period of history, and that's what my book was aiming to change. One of the most deeply rooted stories about this period of history is that Europeans discovered the world, that white men like Christopher Columbus, Hernando Cortez, John Cabot, Captain Cook, and so on, strode across the globe and opened it up to a future of cosmopolitanism and globalization. But from the very first moment that Columbus returned to Europe in 1493, Indigenous Americans too were discovering the world, crossing the Atlantic as diplomats, translators, performers, sailors, servants, family members, and sadly most often as enslaved people. In the first 10 years alone, at least 3,000 Caribbean island people were enslaved and transported to Europe. And tens of thousands of people crossed the Atlantic in this early period, from the Taino people who were brought from the Caribbean by Columbus in 1493 to the Inuit people who showed off their hunting skills by harpooning ducks on the River Avon at Bristol. I don't have time to cover an enormous amount in this time, but today I just want to give you a sense of a few of these stories and perhaps to start to think a little bit about why they matter. I started as a historian of the Aztec people, more properly the Mexica, that's what they'd have called themselves. And so one of the groups of travellers that I encountered first in my research, the group that pointed me towards the possibility of this project a decade or more ago, were the people who came to Spain from Mexico after Hernando Cortés's invasion of the Aztec territories. I was studying what was happening in Mexico, and I just kept noticing travellers to Europe among the accounts. And what I love about the travellers in this group is how diverse they are. They epitomise so well all the different roles of indigenous travellers during this period. There are the 5 or perhaps 6, the sources aren't very precise on this question, Totonac travellers from the eastern region of Mexico who arrived in Spain in 1519 along with a young interpreter, and they were recognised as ambassadors at the court of the Emperor Charles V. Hernando Cortés had landed in Mexico and was engaged in his as yet unsanctioned conquest of the region. As part of his campaign to win the support of the emperor, he sent emissaries to the king carrying, according to his letter, gold, jewels, precious stones, and articles of featherwork. These incredible artifacts were enumerated in considerable detail in the letter that accompanied the gifts, but fascinatingly, he didn't seem to think that the 6 native people who also travelled with the treasure warranted a mention. These 4 men and 2 women were described in detail by the historian Peter Martyr, who was particularly struck by their extravagant lip piercings. And they also appear in a letter from the Pope's representative at court, the Archbishop of Cosenza, who was not at all impressed with the women, whom he found to be small and of ugly expression. We can only imagine what they thought of him. I mean, I'm being flippant about it, but actually, this is a really serious problem for a scholar studying indigenous travellers. The sources we have are almost always written by Europeans who either observed, accompanied, kidnapped, or enslaved the native peoples in question. It's tempting to say that their voices have been lost, but in reality, they were rarely recorded, at least in alphabetic form, in the first place. And so these travellers have tended to be seen as objects of curiosity, of desire, of greed, of prejudice, of ambition. They've become ciphers for European ideas and aspirations rather than actors at the centre of their own story. Changing that was one of the most important aims I had in this book. The incredible works of art that came with the Totonacs are now mostly lost or melted down. So these aren't those exact treasures, they're just similar ones to give you an idea of the sort of thing that would have been brought. But at the time, they toured around Europe and were seen by the artist Dürer, who wrote, "In all the days of my life, I have seen nothing that rejoiced my heart so much as these things, for I saw among them wonderful, wonderful works of art, and I marvelled at the subtle ingenuity of men in foreign lands." What I really love about this is that he's not just seeing the treasure, but also the human hand behind the treasure. Unhelpfully for us, he did not draw any of the treasures, which I find very frustrating. In Spain at around the same time was another young Mexican, enslaved and brought to court by Juan de Ribera, Cortés's envoy, who gave a graphic demonstration of Aztec practices of human sacrifice and captive taking, to the horrified fascination of observers who, again, fortunately for us, included Peter Martyr. According to Martyr, after dragging his unfortunate colleague around by his hair, the Aztec threw him to the ground and, quote, "He feigned to cut open his breast above the heart with a knife. After tearing out the heart, he wrung from his hands the blood flowing from the wound and then besprinkled the sword and shield." I'll just draw your attention to the word feigned there. He's pretending to do it, but it clearly made a big impression on the observers. A few years later, in 1526, 2 of the surviving sons of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, Don Rodrigo and Don Martin, travelled to Spain as ambassadors of their noble families and met with Charles V before being sent to study Christian doctrine in a monastery in Talavera. Rodrigo seems to have stayed in Spain after that point, while Martin, or to give him his full name, Don Martin Cortés Netzahualtecolotl, was one of the 40 or so Nahua men and perhaps women who later accompanied Cortés on his first return to Spain in 1528. Martin had obviously crossed back across the Atlantic and become one of the people engaged in this transatlantic diplomacy. This group included at least 15 Nahua nobles, diplomats hoping to promote their family and community interests at court. These men held powerful claims as descendants of hereditary rulers and were recognized by the Spanish crown as official envoys. The crown was really keen to legitimate its empire in the Americas by allying with the people that it called the señores naturales, the natural lords of the land. Now, we're incredibly lucky here because a painter and actually a medal maker called Christoph Weiditz was at court at the same time as the Nahua people, and he drew images of them from life. The pictures of them actually, though, aren't especially accurate. These images you can see on the screen are some of them. I'm going to show a couple more in a minute. Some of the feathers, if you look carefully at the man with the parrot, the feathers around his waist have actually been added afterwards for modesty to cover up his genitals. And also the style they're wearing is more typical of Brazil than it is of Mexico. It seems like these are kind of exoticized stereotypes, but we still do get some incredible details from these pictures. The conquistador had pulled out all the stops to promote his venture and secure his influence at court. He brought a heap of glittering treasures with him, as well as curious creatures never before seen in Spain, like an armadillo, a possum, pelicans and jaguars. There's actually an amazing story about how he's bringing the jaguars back on the ship, and one of them escapes and chases men around the ship, and there are people kind of jumping off the ship in all directions, but that's story for another time. But it's this astonishing story of the bringing of these new things to Europe that haven't been seen before. And also among the group were jugglers, like the man you can see here, who tossed logs into the air with their feet, as well as musicians and dancers whose grace so delighted Charles V that he sent them on to Rome to entertain Pope Clement VII. These people are really circulating in Europe. There were also about a dozen Tlaxcalans who played the traditional Mesoamerican ball game with great dexterity. Now, you can see them here. This is a much more accurate picture. This is much more likely how they would have appeared from life. And not only the players, but also the ball itself would have been quite a spectacle for Europeans. More than 2 centuries before the French geographer Charles-Marie de la Condamine is credited with becoming the first European to encounter rubber, the Spanish colonist and writer Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo described seeing in Spain the heavy ball which is made from the sap of certain trees and other mixtures which made the ball bounce greatly. Oviedo is actually quite famous for his natural history, which was also most Europeans' first introduction to things like pineapples, tobacco, barbecues, and hammocks. Because, of course, these indigenous peoples didn't come to Europe divorced from their culture. They brought it along with them. You may know that many of the products we take for granted originated in the Americas. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? Roast dinners without potatoes? How about Indian food without chilies? I could just go on and on. But even if you knew about all these foods, you probably don't often think about the indigenous influences behind them. I mean, who do we credit, for example, in the popular myth with introducing tobacco and potatoes to Britain? That's right, Walter Raleigh. Despite the fact that people were smoking and eating potatoes in Europe decades before Raleigh set foot in the Americas, it is Walter Raleigh who is credited with those discoveries in the popular imagination. Now, I know that I should stop soon if I'm talking for 20-25 minutes, but I wanted to talk about one last rather different story, the story of some travellers to Britain. Fewer travellers came to Britain in this early period than to Spain, just because of the fact that the British don't colonise so heavily in the Americas until the 1580s. But some of the most remarkable and best documented stories are of indigenous travellers to Europe. And the one I want to tell you about is the one that I think most stuck with me, most haunted me over thousands of lives, many of them enslaved, tragic, remarkable. And for once, we have an actual painting of them from life. These are drawings by John White, whose work you may recognise. He's famous for his meticulous depictions of the indigenous people of what is now coastal North Carolina. They were his drawings were exhibited in the British Museum a few years ago. These are two Inuit people who were kidnapped by Martin Frobisher and brought to Bristol. But it's not actually two. If you look very carefully, you can see a small child peeking out of the hood of his mother on the right there. This is Nutak, who was brought to England in 1577 and put on display in a London pub. He died after only 8 days in the capital, probably of the measles that had already killed his mother. And he was buried in an unmarked grave at St. Olave's, a tiny church that still stands on the corner of Seething Lane in the City of London. Astonishingly for me, Nutak wasn't even the first of his people to be buried at St. Olave's. The year before, another Inuk man, also here depicted from life, although certainly in an imagined posture in front of the ships. He had been kidnapped the year before from Qikiqtarjuq, also known as Baffin Island now, in what is now northeastern Canada. He was one of the first Indigenous Americans in Britain, and he was shown off by the Cathay Company as a tremendous novelty. His likeness was captured in paint and wax, and it was, according to the Cathay Company, such a wonder unto the whole city and to the rest of the realm. He unfortunately was injured during his capture, and he survived only 2 weeks in London before dying of what the records call a cold which he had taken at sea, perhaps pneumonia. The final cost to the Cathay Company was a payment for burying the Tartar Indian man in St. Olave's churchyard, it says in the accounts. His remains were unmarked, and his death was unremarked in the parish register. The following year, Nutak, a word that actually just means child in Inuktitut, the Inuit language, and his mother, Arnak, a word that just means woman, arrived in Bristol with an unrelated man, Calicho. They're often depicted as a family, but actually he isn't related to the woman and child, though they seem to be very respectful of each other. They too had been kidnapped by Frobisher on his next expedition, and they became local celebrities in Bristol. Calicho paddled up and down the River Avon at high tide, killing ducks with what the source calls his dart, either a harpoon or a spear, we don't know which, to show his skill at seal hunting. But both Arnak and Calicho died after less than a month, and they were buried at a church called St. Stephen's that still stands in Bristol close to the river. I was there not so long ago. We have an incredible record of Calicho's illness and autopsy by a doctor called Dodding, who had treated him during his illness and his final days. And it's just a remarkable record. It shows that Calicho had broken ribs and a collapsed lung that he had sustained during his capture. And Dodding also diagnosed him with something he called Anglophobia, which, according to Dodding, it's a remarkable description of a man who essentially is putting on a brave face in an appallingly difficult situation that he doesn't want to be in. After he dies, Arnak, who is herself already unwell, was unwillingly forced to see Calicho's dissected body and witness his burial. Dodding seemed to think that this would reassure her that the English weren't cannibals. How seeing his dismembered body would reassure her of that, or why she might have thought the English were cannibals in the first place, we don't get to know. He describes Arnak as having a very blank countenance through all of this, which he puts down to her lack of sensitivity, but it seems much more likely to have been shock or trauma, or attempting to, again, to put on a brave face in an appalling situation. I haven't had time to address this in detail, though I did mention it, but coercion, of course, plays an enormous part in the arrival of many, many captives in Europe. The majority of people, in fact, who set foot on European shores in the first 100 years or so were enslaved. And we have incredible records of many of their lives, thanks partly to testimonies in legal cases designed to secure their freedom. There are many other people like Calicho, Arnak, and Nutak who weren't technically enslaved, but were given no choice in their travel, as you can tell from Calicho's injuries. Arnak herself by this point was seriously ill, probably we think with measles, and she died a few days after Calicho. Nutak, left to the dubious care of the Cathay Company, was carried to London and put on display in the Three Swans pub. There, in the heart of a country that deemed itself one of the most civilized in the world at that time, he was made a spectacle for curious Londoners, even though the orphan toddler himself was already sick. Probably around 14 or 15 months old and still nursing when his mother died, we know, because he had to have a wet nurse. Nutak must have been terrified and extremely vulnerable. He died after only 8 days in the capital, as I've said, and was buried in an unmarked grave at St. Olave's, his tiny body laid to rest near his compatriot. Again, unlike, in fact, Calicho and Arnak, whose deaths are recorded in the parish register, his death went unreported. His short life was unrecorded. This is St. Olave's here. You can go and see it. Someone messaged me recently to say that they actually had been to St. Olave's to talk to the church about, because they have lots of historic, because inspired by reading the book, they'd been to St. Olave's, and the parish has lots of information about the history of the church, but nowhere in that information does it mention the Pennock baby who was buried there, despite the fact that I and Cole Thrush, who's worked on this before, have been in touch with them about it. We don't know why. Very few people actually walking past St. Olave's would know of the two Inuit buried in its graveyard. Most people who seek it out, funnily enough, are there because the church was the worship and burial place of the diarist Samuel Pepys. For me, this is an incredible, remarkable contrast. Pepys is buried in honour under the nave. His face and that of his wife glare out at each other across the aisle from the stonework. And frankly, Pepys told us more about his life than we might want to know at times. And then nearby, often forgotten and missing from the parish records, the unmarked remains of Nutak and his compatriot. Pepys is larger in history than he ever was in life, but we have to look really hard at the past to find tiny Nutak peering out from his mother's hood. Like so many Indigenous travellers to Europe, Nutak appears only briefly in history and then vanishes again. But if we're prepared to look hard enough, we can find his traces and those of other native voyagers who came to Europe from as early as 1493. I've only had a chance to touch on just a handful of their histories, but I hope that even this taste has perhaps started to put them back into your mental picture of early modern Europe and to begin to think about why they might matter. And of course, Sam and I would be delighted to take any questions that you might have. So I'm going to end the Zoom and not the Zoom, the PowerPoint, and then do use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have. Just a second while I work out how to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. As many in the audience will know, the history of Sulgrave Manor is inextricably tied into the history of the transatlantic world, of transatlantic diplomacy. But it was so fascinating there to hear the conventional kind of direction of travel flipped on its head, and to be asked to think about not Europeans going to the New World, but Indigenous travellers coming to the Old World. So absolutely fascinating. People will have, I've no doubt, some questions. So as they're getting ready, and as they're getting ready to type those into the Q&A function there, I'm going to kick things off, if I may. And I just really want to start by picking you up on something you mentioned right at the top of the talk there. You talked about how the book sort of emerged over, so I think you said 10 years or so. And I was just intrigued. Was there a particular moment where you just said to yourself, you know, I need to write this history? Or was it something kind of cumulative, which developed over time?
It's sort of a bit of both. I mean, it definitely was cumulative. It started out as a historian of the Indigenous world. There aren't very many of us working in Britain. I started to wonder why we heard so much about Europeans travelling west and so little about Indigenous peoples travelling east. And the more I looked for them, the more those stories started appearing, and it turned out there were really loads and loads of them. And originally it was going to be an academic project, although I've done a lot of public history over the years. It was going to be an academic book about Central Americans, mostly Aztec Nahua people traveling to Spain. And I did write an article that is actually, people can get free if they want to, called Aztecs Abroad, which was kind of a trailer for the book that was more specialist about that. But the longer, perhaps it was a good thing in a way that it took me so long to write it. I had a baby and all sorts of things. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was a kind of bigger story here, not just a project of recovery, of finding those important histories that have often been overlooked and are not so obvious in the sources and in mainstream histories, but also of shifting the popular imagination of those stories. And so in a way, because the project had so long to marinate, and I've thought about it for so long, I found myself realizing that there was a wider potential for it. And also I'd been doing more public history in a kind of practical sense, and I realized, I think, that there was a bigger story that I would really like to tell, and that these people's histories aren't only important in their own right, but in terms of how we view the world in this period. I think people like David Olusoga, Oliveto Tele have done an amazing job putting Black and African descended people back into our understandings of early modern Britain and early modern Europe, but native peoples haven't yet made their way into that understanding, and I really think that it's time for that to happen. The point being that I'm not the first person to notice a lot of these travelers. I did the archival work for some of them, but my colleagues have been writing about them for years, and it hasn't made a dent on the way people see this part of the past. And so it was kind of a twofold project, that academic recovery, but then also the popular one. Sorry.
No, and that absolutely comes through. So if you're thinking out there, haven't had a chance to read the book, yeah, absolutely do, because the timeliness and the urgency, as Caroline describes, that absolutely comes through brilliantly. I've got a couple of questions that have popped through for us, Caroline, so I'll take them from the top.
No, I wonder if we might start with Ollie's, just because it sort of speaks to what we were just talking about.
Absolutely.
And then Carol, we won't ignore your question, don't worry. But do we want to read the question out in case somebody...
Yeah, so Ollie asks about the archival process, and is particularly interested in if Caroline can expand a bit more on the research methodologies that she used in the process of producing this book. Yeah, the research methodologies, Caroline.
So they're very diverse because, as I've said, the sources are very fragmentary, and we don't dismiss it while I'm reading it. Sorry, I was trying to read the question. So it sounds like Ollie is working on something, and I would really like to know what that is. The research method necessarily has to be very diverse, which is something I'm used to from working on Indigenous histories, because naturally you have to incorporate artistic work, archaeological work, oral histories, ethnography, descendant narratives, all sorts of things. It's necessary to do. And I have become much more aware over the last decade or so of how vital it is that we do incorporate not just Indigenous histories, but the voices of Indigenous peoples in these stories, that we recognize the value of these histories to their descendants. And actually, I don't know, talking to a British audience, whether this will be of relevance to anyone, but my American publisher has agreed to give a free copy of the book to any tribal library or similar Indigenous community organization that wanted one. So if you do know anyone who'd like that, then let me know and I'll arrange it. And I mention that because I think that reciprocity for me is part of the research process. You know, I can't draw on these histories and talk about these histories without feeling a responsibility of being the person who's communicating them. I'm not really talking about archival work, am I? So the reality is that the people who are best recorded are the people at the top of the society and the people at the bottom of society. Because, of course, elites leave their own records to some extent, and they are very visible at court and in chroniclers' tales, things like that. People who are a spectacle are often also very visible. So this incredible village that is set up on the banks of the River Seine at Rouen. And again, that is observed by all these royals. It's this amazing Tupi Brazilian village that is mocked up in full in the 1540s on the banks of the Seine. It's just incredible. And that, because it's a big spectacle, is also recorded. But then we also have, I mentioned very briefly, these freedom suits. by people who've been illegally enslaved, because it's illegal to enslave indigenous people under most circumstances in Spanish law. And you get to hear, I mean, it's filtered through the legal process, but you do get to hear their personal testimonies about how they came to Europe and what their experience of Europe was. And very often, for example, you hear about, there's a young man, again, called Martin. It's quite annoying for a scholar of this period that they all are called like Pedro and Juan and Martin, and it's very hard to tell who's who because they all have the same names. Anyway, there's a young man called Martin who is enslaved to a famously brutal figure, actually, in Mexican history. And he is, this man, Salazar, Gonzalo de Salazar, comes to his village and he says, would someone come and be a page for me voluntarily? And Martin is volunteered, but then it turns out the first thing that Salazar does is to brand him on the face. And he later ships him to Spain. He has no choice about this at all. And it's only when he's older that Martin attempts to plead for his freedom. And we have, I can't go into it now, it's all in the book, but we have quite a detailed record of his life from these freedom suits. It's very, very difficult, though, actually, to trace indigenous peoples in the sources, because too often you see exceptions, people who aren't the norm, and also because, as I mentioned, it's illegal to enslave people in Europe under most circumstances, indigenous peoples in Europe. And so they get hidden in the records under words like loro, which means brown, rather than Indio. They're not always Indio meaning Indian. They don't always clearly identify them. And also the word Indio also means from the East Indies, so it can be really complex. In terms of changing the book from just being about Spain to the wider world, I didn't do all the archival work myself for all of that, because you can't. It's a big survey that goes all the way from the Inuit in Canada, the Tupi of Brazil, the Caribbean Taino people. So the colleagues have done a lot of the starting work, but then I went back to the primary sources in every possible case. In a few cases, like there's a Tupi source, I can't translate Tupi, so I've relied on the work of colleagues and advice from colleagues. But so there was a deep kind of period of archival research at the start, a lot of which in fact was done with the aid of a research assistant, because my daughter was very tiny. So Sara Gonzalez did some amazing work in Seville for me, and I work with digitized sources as well. And I think that that's the reality. If you want to do these histories, there's almost an expectation that everything will be online now and you can do everything. Where I think as historians 20, 30 years ago, you would have said, okay, or even 20, 30 years ago, but certainly 50 years ago, you can only do what you can do. Now you're supposed to be able to do everything. Sorry, I've rambled, but I hope, Ollie, that I have given you some sense of where I'm going. I would say that the end notes, for anyone who's interested in this, my publisher very generously did not make me cut anything out. So it does have proper academic endnotes. For anyone who wants to follow up the sources. I think I've probably said enough, but at the same time, nowhere near everything.
Yeah. That was fantastic. I'll just going to piggyback very quickly before we get to Carol's question. And I'm just thinking if there are any budding historians out there, because what you were sort of talking about there, and you talk about it in the book as well, is kind of taking these sources and reading against the grain to get those. Could you just tell us a little bit about sort of that process, about reading against the grain?
Funnily enough, I just did some videos for a teaching website. They're going to use talking about reading against the grain, and that's something a technique that essentially means using sources not for the purpose for which they were developed. And it's looking for the reading between the lines, but also reading them deliberately in a way that inverts their intention, perhaps. So these European chronicles, which are all about European superiority, the chronicles which are of the village at Rouen, for example, are intended to talk about the superiority of the French over the Spanish, to demonstrate the global power of the French crown, all of this kind of thing. But what I look for in them is the experience of the indigenous peoples and how they may have felt about being there. Now, I never say they did feel like this, because of course, who can know? But to do a little in the way of informed speculation, giving context and framing it in ways that put the focus back on those people, what they're doing there, why they're there, how they're experiencing it. And that's what Reading Against the Grain, I would say, is.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. Let's go to Carol's question then, if you're okay with that. So Carol wonders, sorry, if there are any travelers' tales in the other direction. So did any of the visitors to Europe then return and share their experiences?
Yeah, they certainly did. It's very much a reciprocal exchange. Now, lots of people do die in Europe, I should say, just as disease is, and violence is, and dislocation breaks down indigenous communities in the Americas. So unfamiliar diseases also wipe out large numbers of indigenous people in Europe. So of the travelers who come to Spain, the group of Nahua travelers I mentioned, this big group of diplomats and tumblers and jugglers and so on, there's this astonishing source which goes through the accounts. You know, we're paying X amount per person per day, to here's what we're paying. And I was just reading this, what seems like a very dry source, and then it suddenly the number starts reducing. And now this day we're only paying for 9 people because Don Lorenzo died. Now we're only paying for 8 people. And it's this astonishing litany of deaths. And so large numbers of people do not actually get the opportunity to return home, not just because they're enslaved, but because they die in Europe. It's astonishing, in fact, I think, how many people there must lay in European soil unremarked. And we just don't think about them being here. And also descendants here who've kind of blended into European society. Now, that said, lots of people do go back. We don't always have really good records for that, because these are very oral cultures in the main. We have letters, we do have accounts, people like Don Martin and Don Rodrigo, the young men who came to Spain. We have petitions that they sent. They often say things like, we are the people who kissed the hands of your majesty. They're deploying the fact that they've seen him in person in their transatlantic diplomacy. And there's this astonishing source. So I think I've used the word astonishing a lot today, but they are very impressive thing. It's just amazing, some of them. There are these things called the Cantares Mexicanos, which means songs of the Mexicans. And it is the indigenous poetic performance tradition is used to record these travelers' experiences. And I have a chunk of one in the book where these are songs that would have been sung in the streets, would have been performed in communities. And what it shows is that people are learning in an everyday way about these travels. It talks about a dangerous transatlantic voyage, and then these people arrive at court, and you get these really evocative images of the great basilica in Rome. So it presumably was one of the group of people who were sent on to Rome, and in their minds, royal power and religious power and God are all kind of blended as one, as is gold and the desire for gold. Something that indigenous people remark on a lot is the Spanish desire for gold. And what's interesting is, in indigenous thought, so this is in the early period, of course, later on they will have had a much clearer sense of what exactly was on the other side of the Atlantic. But in this early period, Aztec Nahua people believed that the world was like a globe of water. So the world came up to the edges like this. So you're inside this sort of globe of water, and it's transformed from being this dangerous edge to being something you cross. But on the other side of the water is not only the court and the Pope and God as well as on the other side of the water, also the suckling tree, which is where Aztec babies come from, is now in this song framed as on the other side of the water. It's a very cute image, actually. You see pictures of it in codices, and it's literally little babies hanging from a tree waiting to be born. And they believe this now is also on the other side of the Atlantic, where God and Charles V are. And they use a word for the basilica, which is like the Nahua word for womb. So it implies there's a kind of creation aspect there. You also have much better recorded sources. So once we get into the 17th, 18th century, you have really interest, because my work goes up to the founding of Jamestown, so it's that first moment of discovery, you know, all that encounter is what I'm doing. You can't do everything. And there's some great work on the stuff from the 18th century when you get regular embassies going backwards and forwards. But what's absolutely clear is that in this period, perhaps more than you'd expect, Indigenous travellers are treated according to what their status is, rather than to what we would later call their race. And so if you're a royal or a noble who crosses the Atlantic, the crown will keep you in the manner to which you deserve to be kept. So people are sometimes exiled to Spain. There's an amazing story, which I talk about in the book, of an Inca princess, a Nusta Inca princess called Francisca Pizarro Yupanqui, who is a descendant of conquistadors and of the Inca ruler. And she's actually exiled to Spain because they think she's too disruptive to have hanging around in Peru, because they're kind of playing power games. And so they exile her. And of course, she has incredible connections still with people in the Americas, relatives that go back and forth. And she's exiled to Trujillo in Spain. And in Trujillo, there's the Palace of the Conquest, which she builds with her husband. It's slightly creepy. He's her uncle and he's much older. But they build the Palace of the Conquest, and her face is actually on the palace. There's a picture of it in the book. Her face is, I'm trying to think if I can show people. This is actually the American version of the book, because I gave away all my free copies of the English one. But I'm just trying to think if I can find a picture of her face. But she's on the stonework. And when people go to Trujillo, they go there because it's the home of Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador. And they go and they look for him, and they don't look for her. But actually, she is right there, just if you're looking for her. It's one of those things where if you go looking for them, oh, here she is. I don't know if the quality is good enough to try and, oh, it's a bit shiny.
Karen, this is for me one of the most.
There she is.
It's one of the most striking images in the book for me that you talk about, that you know, the picture of an indigenous person in the very stonework of a Spanish castle, which is so powerful in terms of what you're doing in the book. Yeah, and well, and I think it's those traces which are really small sometimes, but are also really ubiquitous when you start looking for them. There are arms of Moctezuma, the coats of arms of the Moctezuma family in Spain. There are, as I say, the Inuit people are recorded in the parish records in Bristol. That church, in fact, is doing some work on how they can commemorate the presence of those people. That's absolutely fascinating. There's a what's the word, obsidian mirror that belonged to Indigenous people in the British Museum, and it's labelled as John Dee's mirror, but it's clearly an Aztec mirror. There's all these traces, which are just remarkable. They are, and I love that bit at the end of the book where you talk about we need to be willing to look harder for the traces, and sort of following up from what you were saying there, Caroline. If people are watching and they're thinking, I would like to go out and encounter a bit of this history, maybe in the British landscape, and Sulgrave Manor is there in Northamptonshire countryside, a bit of transatlantic history. If people want to encounter this history, are there other particular places that you would say, go here and pay attention to this, or go here? Well, that's a good question. I had really hoped to go and encounter more traces, and I wasn't able to because I was writing the book. And so my research leave started, in which I was writing the bulk of the book and was going to go and visit all these places, started in February 2020. And we all know what happened next. Yes. So I haven't done as many as I would have liked to, but actually I would say principally, it's places like London. A lot of these places aren't there anymore. It's about knowing where people went and going there thinking, hang on a second, they were in this street, in this building, alongside these people. It's looking out for them. So Bidford, for example, again, in the parish register at Bidford, it's clear that a young man called Raleigh, presumably after Walter Raleigh, is lived in Bidford in Devon because it's a port city. You have accounts in Portsmouth. You have these two guys, Manteo and Wanchese, who come from the coast of what is now North Carolina, and they come and they
help create what is often called the first indigenous alphabet, the Osamokamuk alphabet, and it's usually credited to a man called Harriet, who worked with Walter Raleigh, but it's actually, he worked alongside Manteo and Wanchese, and that document still exists in the archives of Westminster School. You can see that document. If you go to the British Museum, there are astonishing numbers of indigenous artifacts in the British Museum. There are more than 30,000 known individuals in the storage of the British Museum that have not been returned to their descendant communities. There is an incredible museum, actually, Buxton Museum, that if you Google this, they have just returned. They took the initiative. They had all these indigenous objects, and they took the initiative for finding out where they came from and returning them to their ancestral communities if they wanted them. A really good place to go is the Pitt Rivers, actually, in Oxford, which has far, far too much stuff that belongs to other people, is the long and the short of it, which has just been, so you go and you think, wow, why is there a massive totem pole here? And it was just, and then there are words like, this was brought, and that's the word that's often applied to the indigenous people. These things were brought from somewhere, or these people were brought. But they have these wonderful shirts which belong to the Blackfeet people, and they did do some great work. The Pitt Rivers Museum paid for members of the community to come to Oxford to be with the shirts, which are regarded as ancestors in their own right, to make replicas of the shirts, to handle them, all those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, they didn't give them back. And there's a fantastic article all about it, which I cite in the book. Someone went and worked with the community after, and how they felt about it and this project. And they said, well, it was really amazing to be able to come and do this, but why have my children never seen these? And they have a whole pile of them just there in the museum. It's really, really striking. So I think any museum, almost any large museum, if you go and you look at the indigenous objects and you ask yourself, how did these get here? A really interesting one is so this is a kind of, it's not a secret because obviously I'm saying it to a group of people on the internet, but I went to York's Chocolate Story, and chocolate typically is credited. So York's Chocolate Story says in the background, it's mostly about the history of fries, but it says in the background room at the beginning that the secret of chocolate was brought to Spain by Columbus and Cortez, and was kept a secret by the Pope and the King of Spain. And this is based on no information at all. Nothing, no sources. The first bit of evidence we have for drinking chocolate in Europe, because of course at that time it was all drinking chocolate, is a group of Maya lords, Quechua Maya lords came. It's an incredible story. I've said that too many times, sorry, but they came as an embassy, and if you go back to the homeland where they came from, he is now Don Juan Apot Batz is a hero in his homeland. Where he's credited, he was the first Maya to convert to Catholicism, and he did it to protect his people from the group around him. But one of the other reasons he's a hero is that he refused to bow before Philip, the ruler of Spain, because he said, I too am a king. And they brought with them all these riches of their lands, including drinking chocolate, which they prepared at court. And so there's this much more interesting history, actually, I think, than these fictionalized ones. The coda to that is that I sent a very polite email to York's Chocolate Story and didn't get a reply. So I feel like I'm offering to help them, correct this. So I feel like I'm allowed to say this in public because I did offer to help them. But the reality is that they're not the only people saying that. If you look at on the internet, there's lots of people saying, oh, missionaries brought chocolate back, or Columbus, but actually this is the first record of it.
Outstanding, fantastic. I think we've got a final a question comment that's just popped into the Q&A for us there from Carol. Just a thought here, maybe St Olave's School in Orpington might be interested in that link through St Olave's Church to those burials that you talk about.
Well, that is an interesting question, and I do wonder if they might be. I don't know how connected they are to the church, but it reminds me that the more obvious thing that I could have suggested if people are interested in connecting with Indigenous people is to go to Gravesend, where there is a memorial to Matoaka, better known as Pocahontas. She doesn't feature very much in my book because she's slightly after the period and has been very well studied already. So well studied that her tribal community have a campaign called Leave Matoaka Alone, because they say she has been fictionalized and appropriated and she should just be allowed to rest now. There are other stories you can tell, but certainly it's very possible to go and trace her steps, the places that she went, who she was with. She was depicted from life, and there's a memorial to her at Gravesend.
That's right, and one in Heacham, I think, on the Norfolk coast, I think, as well.
The Gravesend one is because it's where she died.
Yes,
before, on the way home, she didn't make it, but but yes, you're right. There's more than one.
That was fantastic, Caroline. As audience members are now saying in our Q&A here, and Danny says, thanks for a wonderful, informative program. We're just about out of time, but before I wrap things up, a few thank yous. First and foremost, obviously, thank you to Caroline for that fascinating talk there. Lots of wonderful information about how you might encounter the history that she talks about there in the British landscape, some suggestions of places you might visit. But of course, the key thing is you have a good read of her book, On Savage Shores. I'm going to get the subtitle wrong now, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe. And Caroline tells me, if you are interested, there is a certain well-known online outlet which is currently discounting this book. It's in hardback. It's currently discounted at £14, I believe. So if you're interested and want to know more, track that down. Thank you as well.
Paperback in January, though. I hate hardbacks.
And the paperback in January.
Waiting for paperbacks.
And it is both sides of the Atlantic, isn't it, Caroline? It's already out in North America as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Fantastic. Thanks as well to our audience, who again are still throwing comments into the Q&A here, rightly so, to thank Caroline. So thank you to the audience for all those questions. Thanks as well to the genius in the background who has made this all function so smoothly. That's Shanna Wells. And all that's remained for me to say is just to draw your attention to the fact that this is the first of the 2023-24 Sulgrave seminar series. There are more talks upcoming. You will have clocked in the video at the very top of this evening's talk that the next talk is in November. Details to follow. Check out our website when we've got those details pinned down. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Caroline, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next talk in November. Thank you.
Thank you.